Hey friends, I recently noticed that almost 80% of viewers who enjoy these videos haven't subscribed yet. If you like the stories and want to see more, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement makes a huge difference and helps these stories reach more people. Thanks so much for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know. They called it a wisdom eye procedure. My name is George S. Titus, and that's what the surgeons told me before they cut into the area behind my right eye to remove an abscess. What they didn't tell me was that the recovery would dismantle my sanity piece by piece. I won't burden you with the graphic details of the swelling or the stitches. What matters is the perpetual groggy twilight the pain medication forced me into. I existed on a 3-hour timer. Wake up in a disoriented panic. Swallow the pills that made the world soft and blurry, and then drift in a half-dream state until the next cycle began. My sleep schedule wasn't just broken, it was inverted, unnatural. I was a ghost in my own home, most alive in the dead of night. I started to forget what a full night's rest felt like. The line between being asleep and awake dissolved until I was just conscious, trapped in the eerie stillness of my bedroom. It was during one of these lifeless, silent stretches, right in the heart of the night, that the house decided to make a sound of its own. At first, it was just a faint scrape. Then it became a slow, deliberate crawl, moving through the ceiling directly over my head. The sound froze me. It was a subtle thing, really. In the stark, silent emptiness of a 2 a.m. house, every tiny noise is amplified. But this wasn't a creak of settling timber or the groan of pipes. This was a soft, dry scraping, like a bundle of twigs being dragged across rough wood. It moved in a short, hesitant burst, then stopped. I lay there in the profound dark, my right eye throbbing with a dull, familiar ache beneath its bandage, and I held my breath. The heavy-duty painkillers hummed in my veins, making the darkness behind my eyelids pulse gently. And for a moment, I was convinced I'd imagined it. Just another phantom sensation born from a medicated haze. Then, it came again. Scritch, scrape, pause. My logic, sluggish and waterlogged by medication, offered up the easiest explanation. A rat. It had to be. The house was old, a sturdy but aging colonial, and we'd had our skirmishes with squirrels in the eaves before. This was just the latest uninvited guest trying to burrow into the insulation. The thought was almost comforting. A rat was a problem with a solution. A rat was normal. I let out the breath I'd been holding, the sound unnaturally loud in the room. I focused on the pain, a low-grade fire behind my eye socket, and willed the pills to pull me back under. Sleep was the only escape, the only state where the pain receded to a distant murmur. But the door to unconsciousness had slammed shut. I was now painfully, acutely awake. The next night, it returned. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of this bedroom. The doctors had been adamant. Limited light, minimal strain. The heavy curtains were perpetually drawn, casting the room in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. Day and night bled into one another, marked only by the alarm on my phone for my next dose. My existence was a cycle of groggy wakefulness, pill swallowing, and fractured, unsatisfying sleep. Time became a flat circle, and I was trapped at its center. That night, the scraping started earlier, just after the 11 p.m. dose. It was bolder now, less hesitant. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling I couldn't quite see, tracing the sound as it moved from a spot above my dresser towards the center of the room. It wasn't random scurrying. It was a slow, deliberate traversal. Scrape, drag, pause. Scrape, drag, pause. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. A slow, labored breathing through the wood and plaster. I shook my head, a foolish gesture in the dark. That was the medication of toddy. That was the sleep deprivation conjuring patterns from chaos. I fumbled for the plastic water cup on my nightstand. The ice long melted and took a sip. The water was tepid and did nothing to wash away the growing unease. On the third night, the dynamic changed. I had just taken my pills and was sinking into that welcome, numb state when the sound started again. This time, it was directly overhead. I could feel it, a vibration more than a sound. A faint tremor that seemed to travel down through the bed frame. I clenched my jaw, frustration momentarily overpowering fear. Just a rat, I whispered into the darkness, my voice hoarse from disuse. It's just a goddamn rat. As if in response, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow heavier, more menacing than the noise had been. It was a listening silence. I held perfectly still, not even daring to blink. The thumping of my own heart was a drum beat in my ears. I waited, straining to hear any little sound, the scuttle of claws, the rustle of insulation. Nothing. 5 seconds passed, then 10. A full minute crawled by in the absolute quiet. The tension began to leach from my shoulders. I had scared it off. My speaking had startled it. See? Normal animal behavior. I let out a slow, shaky breath and reached for my water cup again. My fingers had just brushed the cool plastic when the scratching started once more, not from the center, but from a new location, right above my headboard. It was faster now, sharper, a series of frantic digging scrapes. My blood ran cold. It hadn't been startled. It had been listening. And now it was answering. That was the first true spike of dread, cold and sharp as an icicle through my chest. This was no longer a simple nuisance, a pest to be dealt with in the daylight. This was an interaction. The thing in my ceiling was aware of me. The hazy barrier between my drug-addled perception and reality, already so thin, tore open a little wider. I pulled the covers up to my chin, a childlike gesture of futile protection, and stared blindly into the blackness above, knowing with a terrifying certainty that something was staring back. The rest of the night was a slow burning torture. The sound would move in these deliberate, searching patterns, sometimes pausing for 20 minutes at a time, only to start again just as my eyelids grew heavy. I began to anticipate its movements, to map its invisible path across my ceiling. It seemed to favor the corners, the space above the light fixture, and, most disturbingly, the rectangular cutout of the ceiling vent that was directly across from my bed. I found myself playing a horrifying game of chicken with it. I would hold my breath and listen, and it would fall silent. The moment I shifted or made a sound, it would respond with a soft, single scrape, a ghostly tap on the shoulder from the world above. "I'm still here," it seemed to say. "I know you're listening." This was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a conscious, intelligent presence that moved when I listened, and listened when I moved. It was in the one place I could not see, separated from me by mere inches of plaster and wood, and it was slowly, methodically, dismantling the last vestiges of my sanity. The dead of night was no longer empty. It was occupied, and it was awake. The knowledge that it was aware of me changed everything. The following days bled together in a smear of exhaustion and mounting terror. My world, once merely shrunken to the dimensions of my bedroom, had now become a vertical prison. The safe space was the floor, the unknown, a malevolent territory mapped out directly above me. The ceiling was no longer a ceiling. It was a lid. The scratching established a brutal routine. Like a clockwork horror, it would begin each night, almost precisely at 2:30 a.m. It was as if the entity, I could no longer think of it as a rat, or even an animal, was tethered to the deadest hour of the night, drawing strength from the world's deepest sleep. My own 3-hour medication cycle became a grim countdown to its arrival. The 11 p.m. dose was filled with dread, the 2 a.m. dose with a heart-pounding anticipation that often rendered the painkillers useless against this new, sharper form of agony. Driven by a need for proof, for some shred of evidence to prove I wasn't spiraling into drug-induced psychosis, I started using my phone. During the daylight hours, when the house was filled with the normal sounds of my parents moving about downstairs, the previous night felt like a bad dream. But the fear was real. I opened a voice memo app and set the phone on my chest. The red recording light, a tiny accusing eye in the dark. The first night I recorded, the scratching began on schedule. I lay perfectly still, watching the timer on the screen count the seconds. After a minute of the slow, dragging scrapes, I spoke, my voice a dry croak. "I can hear you." The scratching stopped instantly. The silence on the recording was absolute. I could hear my own ragged breath, the rustle of my sheets. I waited a full 2 minutes, the pressure in my chest building. Then, tentatively, I whispered, "What are you?" A single, sharp scrape answered from directly above the phone. A response. A confirmation. I stopped the recording and played it back. There it was, in sterile digital audio. My question, and the immediate, intelligent reply. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. This was real. It was listening. It was communicating. The hallucinations, or what I desperately tried to write off as hallucinations, began to intensify. The medication haze created phantom movements at the edges of my vision. When I blinked, I'd see after images of dark, spindly shapes retreating into the room's corners. I'd wake from a micro-sleep convinced I'd seen a long, pale hand withdraw from the foot of my bed. I blamed the pills, the pain, the exhaustion. I repeated it like a mantra. It's the medication. It's the withdrawal. It's not real. But the voice memo on my phone, saved and resaved under the Wen Jianming proof, screamed otherwise. 4 nights after the conversation, the nature of the intrusion escalated from auditory to physical. I was staring at the ceiling, as had become my custom, tracing the faint pattern of the texturized plaster in the gloom. My gaze kept returning to a spot directly above my head, a place the scratching had favored recently. There was a slight discoloration there, a watermark from some forgotten leak that I'd seen 1,000 times before. But tonight, it looked different. It seemed deeper. I fumbled for my heavy-duty flashlight, my hands trembling. I thumbed the switch, and a bright white beam cut through the darkness, pinning the spot. I saw it then. The plaster was bulging. Not much, just a subtle, downward sag, as if something with significant weight was pressing down on it from the other side. The texture was distorted, stretched. I watched, hypnotized by horror, as a fine crack, no longer than my pinky finger, snaked its way through the paint. My breath hitched. This was no longer a game of sounds. It was testing the barrier. The following night was the night of the vent. The scratching was more frantic than ever. A frenzied, digging sound that centered entirely on the rectangular ceiling vent across from the foot of my bed. The vent was the one opening, the one gateway between my world and its. The sound was no longer one of movement, but of focused effort. It was trying to get in. A strange, cold calm settled over me. The fear was still there, a frozen knot in my stomach, but it was now accompanied by a desperate, furious need to see, to know what was tormenting me. I had to look. I had to shine a light into the darkness and see what looked back. I picked up the flashlight. It felt heavy and alien in my sweat-slicked hand. The scratching continued, unabated, a dry, rustling percussion to my terror. I pointed the beam at the vent, my arm shaking so badly the rectangle of light jittered across the ceiling. I took a deep, shuddering breath, held it, and focused the light directly into the slats of the vent. For a single, heart-stopping second, I saw nothing but the dark, dusty interior of the ductwork. Then, something shifted in the deeper blackness. Something moved forward, and 2 milky, lidless eyes blinked slowly back at me. They were horrifically close, pressed against the other side of the slats. They weren't reflective like an animal's. They were a flat, opaque white, like hard-boiled eggs, veined with faint traces of pink. There was no pupil, no iris, just a solid, soulless, pale expanse. But they saw me. I felt their gaze like a physical shock, a wave of nausea and primal revulsion, a high, thin sound escaped my lips, a whimper of pure, undiluted terror. As if the sound had broken a spell, the flashlight in my hand died. Not a flicker, not a dimming, but an instantaneous, total extinction. One moment, the beam was illuminating that monstrous face. The next, we were plunged into absolute blackness. From the hallway, just outside my bedroom door, came a loud, slow groaning. Creak. The attic's door. It was opening by itself. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I threw myself down, yanking the thick comforter over my head, making myself as small as possible. The childish act was an instinct, a futile attempt to disappear. I curled into a tight ball, my bandaged eye pressed into the mattress, my good eye wide open in the stifling, fabric-smelling darkness. Beneath the covers, the scratching in the vent had stopped, but a new sound began. A slow, wet, dragging crawl. It was no longer in the ceiling. It was in the attic now, moving with a heavy, ponderous weight. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It moved from the area above my room, out into the hallway ceiling, tracing a path directly above where I lay hiding. Then, it stopped directly over my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a God I hadn't thought of in years. The silence was a physical weight crushing me. I could smell something now, a faint, coppery odor mixed with the damp earthiness of a long-sealed tomb. It was the smell of the vent. It was its smell. A final, heavy thud landed on the ceiling right above my head, so hard a fine dusting of plaster drifted down onto the comforter. Then, nothing. The rest of the night passed in a petrified void. I didn't move, didn't sleep. I just lay there, waiting for the sound of the attic door creaking shut, or for the wet crawling to start again, this time on my side of the ceiling. But there was only silence. A deep, absolute, and victorious silence that lasted until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed around the edges of the curtains. Dawn did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of terror, one laced with the cold, sterile light of reason. As the sun rose, bleaching the world of shadows, the events of the night felt like a fever dream, a grotesque phantom conjured by a wounded mind swimming in a chemical soup. The silence in the house was no longer menacing. It was accusatory. It seemed to ask, "Are you really so weak?" I lay unmoving until I heard the familiar, comforting sounds of my parents starting their day downstairs. The gurgle of the coffee maker, the muffled murmur of the morning news. Only then did I dare to emerge from my cocoon. Plaster dust, fine and white as snow, coated the navy blue comforter. I stared at it, my heart thudding dully. Proof, tangible, physical proof. I forced myself to get up, my body aching as if I'd been beaten. My first stop was the hallway. The attic door, a simple white-painted rectangle set into the ceiling, was closed. It looked utterly normal. I dragged a chair over from the corner, my legs trembling, and stood on it. I reached up, my fingers hesitating for a moment before pressing against the cool wood. It was firmly shut. I pushed it open a crack. Beyond was only darkness and the faint, dusty smell of insulation. No coppery odor, no sign of wetness. Had I imagined the creak? Had the pressure in my own head manufactured the sound? I climbed down, my mind a whirlpool of doubt. The flashlight. I snatched it from my nightstand. I clicked the switch. Nothing. I unscrewed the cap and shook the batteries into my palm. They were brand new, heavy, and full of charge. I put them back in, my fingers fumbling. I clicked the switch again. The beam erupted, bright and steady, casting a clear circle of light on the wall. A cold dread settled in my stomach. It hadn't been the batteries. At breakfast, I tried to explain. The words sounded insane even to my own ears. "There's something in the attic," I began, my voice still hoarse. It talks to me through the ceiling." My mother placed a gentle hand on my bandaged forehead. "Oh, George, it's the medication, honey. The doctor said it could cause vivid dreams, hallucinations. You're not sleeping. It's making you see things." "It's not dreams," I insisted, a desperate edge to my voice. "I recorded it. I saw it in the vent. It's eyes." "Eyes," my father interrupted, his tone a mixture of concern and impatience. "Son, it's a rat. A big one, maybe. Or a raccoon. We'll call an exterminator next week. But you need to rest. You're working yourself up and it's not good for your recovery." They exchanged a look. The look of sane, rational people dealing with a delirious child. Their logic was a fortress, and my evidence, a dusty blanket and a malfunctioning flashlight, was pathetic ammunition against it. I fell silent, the isolation closing in around me more completely than the walls of my bedroom ever could. They didn't believe me. No one would. That afternoon, fueled by a frantic, simmering panic, I took matters into my own hands. While my parents were out, I went to the garage and found my father's toolbox. I selected the heaviest hammer and a fistful of 3-inch nails. I dragged the chair back into the hallway, my surgical wound throbbing in protest. I positioned the first nail against the top corner of the attic door and swung. Bang, bang, bang. Each strike was a declaration of war, a physical affirmation of my sanity. I drove 6 nails into the frame, 3 on each side, anchoring the door firmly to the surrounding wood. The door was now sealed, a barrier, a statement. You are not welcome here. I stood back, sweating and breathing heavily, the hammer hanging from my hand. The sealed door was a comfort. It felt solid, final. Night fell. I took my medication with a sense of grim resolve. The nails were in place. The door was shut. Let it scratch. Let it crawl. It was trapped up there, and I was down here. The rules had changed. The house settled into its nocturnal silence. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat propped against my headboard, the dead flashlight in my lap like a talisman, my ears straining. The clock on my phone ticked over to 2:30 a.m. Nothing happened. A sliver of hope, fragile and thin as a razor blade, began to cut through the dread. Maybe I had won. Maybe the nails had worked. Maybe it was just an and it had found itself trapped and given up. Then, at 3:07 a.m., I heard the first nail groan. It was a sound of immense protesting strain, the shriek of wood fibers being forced apart. It came from the hallway. My blood turned to ice. I sat bolt upright. Pop. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent house. The first nail had been forced out. I heard it clatter onto the hardwood floor of the hallway. Pop. A second one. I couldn't move. I could only listen, paralyzed, as my feeble fortress was dismantled from the other side. Pop. 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 The final nail hit the floor and rolled in a slow, lazy circle before coming to a rest. There was a long, pregnant pause. Then, the slow, wet, dragging sound began again. But it wasn't in the attic anymore. It was on the ceiling of the hallway, just outside my door. Thump. Drag. Thump. Drag. It was heavier now, laden with a terrible, deliberate purpose. My bedroom door was locked, but what was a lock to a thing that could walk on ceilings? The sound moved. It didn't travel down the hall. It came across the ceiling directly over my door, and then, without pause, it continued onto the ceiling of my room. I looked up, my mouth agape in a soundless scream. I could hear the wet, sticky sound of its passage directly above me. It was moving in a slow, inverted circle around my bed, the sound of its dragging weight a grotesque parody of a lullaby. My flashlight suddenly flickered to life in my lap, the beam pointing straight up, illuminating the ceiling. The light stuttered, flashing on and off, creating a sick, strobing effect. In the frantic bursts of light, I saw it, a pale, hairless shape, the color of a grub, was crawling upside down. Its limbs were long and jointed all wrong, moving with a fluid, boneless grace. It was directly above me, and as the flashlight beam held for one last, sustained second, its head rotated a full 180 degrees on its neck, and I saw the face. It was the same face from the vent, milky, lidless eyes, a slit for a nose, a lipless mouth that was stretched into a rictus of a smile. It was sliding, head first, down the wall beside my bed. The scream that had been trapped in my chest finally tore its way out of my throat, a raw, primal sound of utter annihilation. As my scream echoed through the room, the attic door in the hallway burst open with a splintering crash. The flashlight died. The thing on the wall was gone. The only sound was the frantic, ragged gasping of my own breath. I don't know how long I sat there, catatonic, in the absolute dark. I was still there when the sun rose. I was still there when my parents, alarmed by the splintered wreckage of the attic door and the nails scattered on the floor, found me. They called the doctor. They adjuncted at my medication. They spoke in hushed tones about psychotic episodes. A week later, when I was finally calm enough to speak, my father mentioned, offhandedly, that the maintenance men had been to check the attic for that raccoon I was so worried about. "They didn't find any animals, son," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But they did find something strange. Long tufts of hair, like human hair, all tangled in the insulation above your room. Must have been from the previous owners. Weird. He looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. I just stared past him, at the pristine, newly repaired ceiling, and listened to the perfect, absolute silence. Hit subscribe if you believe people who've seen the impossible deserve to be heard. George's doctors called it hallucinations and sent him home with empty reassurances. Don't be like the people who dismissed his terror as drug-induced fantasy. Subscribe if you think some experiences are too real to explain away. And if you've ever been told your fear was all in your head when you knew it wasn't, comment. I saw it too. Weeks bled into months. The raw, screaming terror of my recovery had scabbed over, leaving behind a numb, brittle scar. The doctors pronounced me healed. The bandages came off, revealing a face that felt less like mine and more like a mask I was wearing. My parents stopped speaking in those hushed, careful tones, and the world, mercifully, seemed to forget. I tried to forget, too. I packed the memory of the milky eyes and the wet, dragging sounds into a mental lockbox and threw away the key, pretending the lockbox didn't sometimes shudder in the dead of night. This weekend was part of the forgetting, a deliberate step back towards normalcy. Diane, my girlfriend, had suggested it. Your parents' country house, she'd said, her hand warm on mine. Just us, quiet, no memories. Her presence was an anchor, a tether to the sane, sunlit world I feared I'd lost forever. Diane M. Souza, with her pragmatic smile and her unwavering belief in things you could see and touch, was the perfect antidote to the formless dread that still clung to me. The weather, however, had other ideas. It had begun raining on Friday afternoon, a steady, monotonous downpour that showed no sign of relenting. By Saturday night, the world outside the sprawling living room window was a black, watery void. The rain was a constant, hissing static, a sound that swallowed all others. Inside, the only light came from the flickering television, casting shifting blue shadows across the room as some forgotten old movie played out. We were nestled on the large sofa, a fortress of blankets and comfort. But the atmosphere was thick, claustrophobic. The cozy isolation we'd planned for felt more like a siege. I was trying to lose myself in the film, in the simple, predictable plot. But my senses were on a low, constant hum. The patter of rain on the roof was too close to the sound of frantic scratching. The groan of the old house in the wind was too similar to a creaking attic door. Diane, sensing my tension, squeezed my arm. You okay? You've been quiet all night. Just tired, I lied, forcing a smile. The rain, it's loud. That's when we heard it. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was crisp, polite almost, cutting cleanly through the white noise of the storm. It came from the direction of the large living room window, which looked out onto the wraparound porch and the impenetrable darkness beyond. We both froze. The movie's dialogue became meaningless noise. Diane's eyes were wide, fixed on the black rectangle of the window. What was that? My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs, but my mind, the part that was still George S. Titus, the rational man, scrambled for a lifeline. "A branch," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "The wind's knocking a branch against the house. This place is surrounded by trees." Even as I said it, I knew it was wrong. The knocks hadn't been the random, rattling percussion of wood on wood. They had been spaced, intentional. "It didn't sound like a branch," Diane whispered. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I had to prove it, to her and to myself. I had to shine a light on the fear and watch it vanish. "I'll check." I threw off the blanket, my movements jerky. I found the heavy-duty flashlight in a kitchen drawer. A different one, I told myself, not the one that had died in my room, and unlocked the back door. The rain was a cold, slapping shock, soaking my sweater instantly. The beam of the flashlight was a frail, trembling wand in the overwhelming darkness. I swept it across the porch, the light bouncing off the glistening wooden planks and the dripping railing. Nothing. I moved to the spot outside the living room window, my shoes squelching in the sodden grass. I aimed the beam upwards, searching for the offending branch. There was nothing near the glass. The nearest tree was a good 15 feet away, its limbs swaying gently. None long enough to reach the house. My throat went dry. I circled the entire structure, the flashlight beam probing every shadow, every corner. Emptiness. Silence, save for the relentless hiss of the rain. The feeling of being watched was a physical pressure between my shoulder blades. I hurried back inside, dripping and cold, locking the door behind me with a definitive click. "See? Nothing," I said, trying to sound reassuring as I toweled my hair. Diane hadn't moved. She was still staring at the window, her face pale. She pointed a trembling finger. "While you were out there, after you passed by with the light." "What?" The word was a croak. "Something moved against the glass." She swallowed hard, her eyes wide with a fear I recognized all too well. It was just a shape, a faint press, like someone leaning against it from the inside. "But, George, you were outside." The lockbox in my mind burst open, and every suppressed horror came flooding back. The milky eyes in the vent, the wet, dragging crawl. Diane turned to me, her expression one of pure, unvarnished terror. "I swear, George," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It was watching you." Diane's words hung in the air, freezing the very space between us. "It was watching you." The cozy country house was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a glass box suspended in a storm, and something was peering in. We retreated to the guest bedroom at the back of the house, as far from the living room window as we could get. The rationalizations were exhausted. We didn't speak of branches or raccoons. We locked the door and pushed a heavy armchair against it. A pathetic but symbolic barricade. The rain continued its endless assault, a million tiny fingers tapping on the roof, a sound that was now maddening in its ambiguity. Was it just rain? Or was it masking something else? Sleep was impossible. Diane lay rigid beside me, her eyes wide open, reflecting the faint digital glow of the clock. I stared at the ceiling, the old familiar dread coiling in my gut. This was different from the bedroom, though. This was sharper, more present. It wasn't a thing in the ceiling. It was here, in our space, playing with us. Around 2 a.m., the power flickered. The lights in the hallway died for a heart-stopping second, then surged back on with a dull hum. The television in the living room, which we'd left on for comfort, went silent and dark. In the new, profound quiet, the sound of the rain became a canvas, and on that canvas, another sound was painted. "Do you hear that?" Diane whispered, her voice thin as glass. I held my breath. At first, there was only the rain. Then, I caught it, a sibilant, rhythmic whisper threading between the downpour's beats. It was too faint to make out words, a ghost of a sound, like a radio tuned to a dead station in another room. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking returned, not from the living room this time. It came from the wall beside our bed, louder, more insistent. A demand. A cold fury boiled up inside me, overpowering the fear. This thing, whatever it was, had followed me. It had tormented me in my weakness, and now it was threatening Diane. I wouldn't stand for it. "I'm ending this," I snarled, throwing the covers back. "George, no!" Diane clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "I have my phone this time," I said, my voice shaking with a volatile mix of terror and rage. "I'll record it. I'll get proof." I opened the camera app, set it to video, and propped it on the nightstand. Pointed at the door. I grabbed the flashlight again, the same one from my recovery, now a hated totem, and unlocked the bedroom door. "Lock it behind me," I instructed Diane. Her face was a mask of pure horror, but she nodded. I stepped into the dark hallway, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path. I moved through the living room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The large window was a black mirror, reflecting my own pale, terrified face back at me. I saw nothing else. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold rain a shock. I swept the light across the exterior wall next to our bedroom window. Nothing. No branches, no animals, no person. I was drenched and shivering, standing in the exact spot where Diane had seen the shape. I shone the light through the glass into our bedroom. I could see the faint red recording light of my phone on the nightstand. I saw nothing else. From inside, muffled by the glass and the rain, I heard Diane scream. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was a scream of absolute, soul-shattering terror. I threw myself at the back door, fumbling with the lock, my hands numb and clumsy. I burst inside and sprinted down the hall. Diane was frantically pulling the chair away from our door. She yanked it open and fell into my arms, sobbing uncontrollingly. "The window," she choked out, pointing a trembling finger back into the room. "While you were right there, shining your light, a face, it was on the inside of the glass. It was right beside you, George. It was smiling. The police came. They were polite, professional, and utterly useless. They took our statements with skeptical patience. They found no footprints in the mud outside, no signs of forced entry. They suggested it was a prank, maybe kids, and that the stress of the storm and the power outage had heightened our imaginations. They left, their flashing lights painting the walls blue and red before disappearing into the rain, taking all hope of external validation with them. After they were gone, a grim silence settled over us. We were alone again with the truth they refused to see. It was Diane who remembered. We had set up a baby monitor in the living room for our dog when we first arrived, and had never packed it away. The parent unit was still on the nightstand. With a morbid, trembling curiosity, I picked it up. I rewound the audio from the moment I had stepped outside. We heard the hiss of the rain from the monitor speakers. We heard the faint sound of me moving around outside. Then, clear as a bell, a soft, wet whisper emanated from the device, a voice that seemed to be formed from the spaces between the raindrops. George. It was my name, drawn out in a long, possessive sigh. Diane looked at me, all the color drained from her face. The last vestiges of her pragmatic world had crumbled. She wasn't crying anymore. Her voice was a hollow, broken thing as she wrapped her arms around herself. "It's not outside anymore, George," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the dark hallway. "It's inside the house now." The police's departure didn't just leave silence in its wake. It left a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured a new, more intimate kind of dread. Their rational explanations were a life raft we'd been clinging to, and they had deliberately sawed it in half. We were adrift in the impossible. We couldn't stay in the bedroom. The memory of the face on the inside of the glass had poisoned the air. We gathered our blankets and pillows and retreated to the small, windowless guest room at the very center of the house. It felt like the heart of a fortress, the most defensible position. We pushed a dresser against the door, a heavier, more final barricade than the chair. There was no glass here for anything to press against. No outside. Just us and the house. Sometime after midnight, the rain stopped. The sudden absence of its constant white noise hiss was jarring. The world outside became unnervingly still and quiet. This new silence was heavier, thicker than the one before. A listening silence I remembered all too well. It was the silence of my recovery room. The silence that meant we were no longer alone. Diane, exhausted from terror, had fallen into a fitful sleep beside me. I remained propped against the headboard, a sentinel in the dark, my ears straining against the quiet. The digital clock glowed 3:00 a.m. That's when I heard it. A sound from above. Directly over the bed was a small rectangular ceiling vent, identical to the one in my old bedroom. From it came a soft, rhythmic sound. Shh, it was breathing, not the frantic, panicked panting of an animal. This was slow, deliberate, and wet. It was the exact same pattern I had heard months ago, moving through the insulation of my ceiling. The thing from the attic had found a new conduit. It was right above us, separated only by a thin metal grate, breathing the same air we were. A cold sweat broke out across my body. I didn't dare move, didn't dare wake Diane. To acknowledge it felt like an invitation, but the house had other plans. Diane stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open. She hadn't heard the breathing yet. Her face was creased with a different fear. "Do you hear that?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "It sounds like crying." I listened, pushing past the horrifying rhythm from the vent. And there it was, a faint, muffled whimpering. It didn't come from outside the door or from the vents. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sad, lost sound that wavered between a child's sob and the mewling of a wounded animal. It was a sound designed to pull at your heartstrings, to make you want to investigate, to help. Then came the footsteps. They were soft, almost delicate, but unmistakable. They echoed from inside the hallway ceiling, directly above where the attic door would be. Step, drag. Step, drag. It was the same gait, the same wet, sticky cadence I remembered with soul-deep horror. It was pacing, a slow, patient patrol just on the other side of the plaster. Diane's hand found mine in the dark, her grip vice-tight. We sat like that for what felt like hours, trapped in a symphony of terror conducted from the other side of reality. The wet breathing above, the pathetic crying within the walls, the deliberate footsteps in the ceiling. We were surrounded. The first gray light of dawn was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. As the room lightened from pitch black to a soft gray, the sounds faded, one by one. The crying dissolved into a last hiccuping sigh. The footsteps took one final heavy step and were gone. The breathing from the vent slowed, then stopped altogether. The silence that returned was fragile, but it was a silence we could finally break. We waited until the sun was fully up before moving the dresser and opening the door. The house was still. We moved through it like archaeologists in a tomb, afraid of what we might unearth. We found it in the living room. There, on the polished wooden floor, directly beneath the large window, was a single set of muddy footprints. They were shapeless, more like wet, gritty stains than defined prints. But they were there. They started at the window and led a few steps into the room before stopping abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had simply vanished into the air. The police had found nothing outside, but this was inside. This was proof they couldn't explain. We packed our bags in a frantic, silent hurry. We didn't speak until we were in the car, the engine running, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror. It was only then, as the miles stretched between us and that place, that Diane spoke, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I dreamed last night," she said, her voice distant. After everything. I dreamed of the face. It was pressed against the glass, but it wasn't outside. It was in the dream with me, and it was smiling. Not a happy smile, a hungry one. And it was breathing in, like it was sucking the air right out of the room. She turned to look at me, her expression hollow. And underneath its breathing, she whispered. I could hear it. The same 3 knocks, over and over again. Tap, tap, tap. It was counting down to something. George. Hit subscribe if you believe experiencing horror together doesn't make you crazy. It makes you witnesses. The police dismissed both Diane and George, calling it shared delusion. Don't let their testimony be silenced. Subscribe if you stand with those who've seen what they can't unsee. And if you've ever been the only person who believed someone's impossible story, comment, I believe you. My name is Hector L. Holmquist. I'm an IT technician, and I find a strange comfort in the logic of machines. Code compiles, or it doesn't. A network is live, or it's dead. There is a binary truth to my work that I've built my life around. It's probably why I like the quiet of the night shift, and the quiet of my 4-bedroom duplex. Too much space for one man, people say, but the emptiness is a feature, not a bug. It means no unexpected variables, no unpredictable noise. Tonight was a standard night, the kind I prefer. A late spring thunderstorm was grumbling in the distance, a spectacular light show over the hills that I watched between debugging lines of Python. The house was a cocoon of predictable sounds, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft whir of my computer's fans, the occasional clink of my coffee mug on the desk. Order. Routine. It started at 2:45 a.m., a precise time. I remember because I had just glanced at the clock, thinking about a coffee refill. The lights flickered once, a hesitant blink that made my screen stutter. Then they died completely. The room was plunged into a blackness so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. The hum of the refrigerator cut out mid-cycle. The fans on my computer fell silent. The sudden void of sound was more shocking than the loss of light. The storm was still there, but now it was muffled, distant, as if the house had been wrapped in thick felt. This was a different kind of quiet than I was used to. This was a dead quiet, a silence with weight and pressure. It was the silence of a vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. I sat still in my chair, waiting. Power outages weren't uncommon out here. The lines were old. Usually, the utility company's automated system would text me within minutes with an estimated restoration time. No text came. That's when I heard the first footstep. It came from the far end of the hallway, just beyond the living room. A single solid thud on the hardwood floor. My body went rigid. I held my breath, my ears straining against the oppressive silence. Thud. Another one. Closer. Just past the living room now. It was a slow, deliberate footfall. Unhurried, confident. The steps were heavy, with a slight drag to them, as if the person was weary, or perhaps not entirely accustomed to the act of walking. Thud. My mind, trained for logic, scrambled for a solution. A burglar. It had to be. The storm, the power outage. It was the perfect cover. My heart began to hammer, a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs. I was a sitting duck in my office. My bedroom was my sanctuary, It had a solid door, a lock. Moving with a slowness I didn't know I possessed, I rose from my chair. Every creak of the floorboards under my own weight sounded like a gunshot. I crept to the door of my office, peered into the pitch-black hallway leading to the bedrooms, and then made a break for it. I slipped into my bedroom, closed the door as quietly as I could, and turned the lock. The solid click was a small, fleeting comfort. I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on the thin line of darkness beneath it. The footsteps continued their slow, methodical advance down the hall. Thud, drag, thud, drag. They didn't speed up. They didn't slow down. They were utterly unfazed by my movement, by my hiding. They walked with the inevitability of a ticking clock. Thud, drag. They stopped directly outside my door. I could see no shadow blocking the light from under the door because there was no light. But I could feel a presence there. A change in the pressure of the air, a coldness seeping through the wood. My voice, when I found it, was a strangled croak. "Who's there?" No response, only the faint sound of the storm outside. "I've called the police," I lied, the words trembling in the air. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any reply. It was a silence of consideration. Then, the doorknob began to turn. It wasn't a frantic jiggling. It was a slow, smooth, mechanical rotation. The brass knob, cool to the touch, turned with a soft, grinding sound. I watched, paralyzed as it rotated a full 90 degrees, then another 30. It stopped, perfectly halfway, pointing at the floor. It held there. The message was clear. The lock was no obstacle. It was not a barrier. It was a formality it had chosen, for the moment, to observe. And from the other side of the inch-thick wood, I heard it. A soft, wet, rhythmic sound. Shh, kish, it was breathing. Right there, on the other side of the door, listening to me listen to it. I stood frozen in the center of my room, a man who believed in binary truths, trapped in the terrifying gray space between one breath and the next. I have no memory of when the breathing stopped. I must have stood there in the center of my bedroom for an hour, or perhaps only minutes. My entire world narrowed to the sound on the other side of the door. At some point, the storm outside lessened. At some point, the faint, pre-dawn light began to bleed around the edges of the window blinds. And at some point, I realized the only sound I could hear was the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of my own heart. The knob had long since turned back to its original, upright position. The presence was gone. I didn't sleep. I stood my vigil until the sun was fully up, casting solid, rational-looking shapes across my floor. Only then, with muscles screaming in protest, did I dare to approach the door. I pressed my ear against the cool wood. Nothing. I turned the lock, the sound obscenely loud, and pulled the door open a crack. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, my body tensed for an attack that didn't come. The house was still, bathed in morning light. Everything was in its place. My computer in the office, the coffee mug on the desk, it looked so normal. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a waking nightmare born of stress and a late night. Then I looked down at the floor. A trail of wet footprints led from the back of the house, through the living room, down the hall, and stopped directly in front of my bedroom door. My blood ran cold. The alarm system. I rushed to the keypad by the front door. Its small screen glowed green, armed. No logs of entry or exit. No triggered sensors on the doors or windows. According to the system, the fortress had never been breached. I forced myself to look back at the footprints. They were all wrong. They were small, no larger than a child's, but the shape was bizarre. They weren't the clear impression of a shoe or a bare foot. The forepart was a mess of dots and smudges, as if made by knuckles, while the heel was a deeper, more defined oval. The gate was unnaturally short, the steps placed close together, with that same slight drag I had heard in the night. They looked like the prints of something that had crawled, but had chosen, for a time, to walk upright. The police came, of course. 2 officers, different from the ones in my neighborhood. They were polite, patient, and utterly dismissive. "Condensation," the older one said, rocking back on his heels as he looked at the prints, which were already beginning to fade. "You said the power was out. The AC cuts off. Humidity spikes. Moisture can condense on the cold pipes under the floor, drip down, create patterns. Looks weird, but we see it all the time in these older places after an outage." I tried to explain the doorknob, the breathing, the footsteps. They listened with the placid, distant expressions of men who had already filed the case away in their minds. "Stressful night," the younger one offered. "Storm, power out, living alone. Your mind can play tricks." They left me standing in my hallway, the condensation theory hanging in the air like a bad smell. They hadn't seen the knob turn. They hadn't heard the wet, patient breathing. I was alone again with the truth. Logic. That's my domain. If the system couldn't see it, I would find a system that could. I spent the day setting up a network of old smartphones as security cameras, positioning them to cover the hallway, the living room, and the back door. I synced them to a cloud server that would record on motion detection. I was building a trap for the impossible. The next night, I went through the motions. I made coffee. I pretended to work. But my attention was on the clock. 2:30 a.m. 2:40 a.m. My heart began its familiar, frantic rhythm. At 2:46 a.m., the lights flickered and died. The silence descended, heavier than the night before. I was already in my bedroom, the door locked, my laptop open and connected to the camera feeds. The screen showed 4 views of my empty, dark house. Then the sound began. The same slow, dragging footsteps. Thud, drag, thud, drag. I watched the screens. Nothing. The hall camera showed an empty corridor. The living room was still, but the footsteps grew closer. They reached my door and stopped. On the laptop screen, the view from the hall camera remained pristine, empty. The doorknob began to turn.
This time, it didn't stop halfway. It rotated slowly, smoothly, a full 180 degrees until the latch clicked open. I watched, paralyzed as the door pushed inward a fraction of an inch. Then, as if reconsidering, the knob turned back, re-engaging the lock with a soft, final click. The footsteps receded. When I was sure it was over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type, I pulled up the cloud recording. I scrubbed to 2:46 a.m. and played it back. The video was useless. 4 angles of a dark, empty house. But the audio... I turned up the volume, my ear pressed to the speaker. There it was, the clear, unmistakable sound of the footsteps approaching my door. The silence as it stopped, the sound of the knob turning, and then, just before the footsteps receded, a sound that made my blood freeze solid. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft, rhythmic knocks. Identical, I was sure, to the ones from the stories I'd dismissed as viral fiction. The recording ended. I sat in the silence of my room, the echo of those 3 knocks ringing in my ears. A new file had been uploaded to the server alongside the video, time-stamped 2:46 a.m. A file I had not created. Its name was a single chilling word. I clicked it open. It was an audio clip, no longer than 2 seconds. A faint, whispering voice, distorted and wet, spoke a name that was not mine. A name I had heard before, in an online story about a man with a wisdom eye extraction. My own voice was a dry, terrified rustle in the dark. Who's George? The name George became an obsession. It was a single frayed thread in the dark tapestry of this horror, and I clung to it. The police were useless. My logic-based world had failed. This was a different kind of problem, one that operated in the spaces between reality, and my only lead was a whisper from a ghost in my own machine. I spent the daylight hours in a frantic, caffeine-fueled haze, scouring the internet. I typed in every variation I could think of. George ceiling eyes. George attic nightmare. George wisdom eye. It felt insane, like trying to diagnose a cancer by reading tea leaves. But then, I found it. On an obscure forum dedicated to paranormal accounts, buried pages deep in a thread titled Unexplained Sleep Phenomena, was a post from a user named Titus. The subject line was, "The thing in my ceiling during recovery." My heart stalled in my chest as I read. It was all there. The wisdom eye extraction, the medication haze, the scratching that became a crawl, the description of the milky, lidless eyes in the vent, the wet, dragging footsteps in the attic, the nailed-shut door that burst open. The details were a perfect, horrifying echo of the file on my server. This was my George S. Titus. But the true connection, the one that sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins, was in the comments. Another user had asked Titus for more specifics. His reply, "It always happened at the same time, 2:46 a.m., like clockwork. And it always started with the same 3 knocks. 2:46 a.m.,
the exact timestamp on my recording. The same 3 knocks. It wasn't just a similar story. It was the same entity, and it was hopping from host to host, from house to house, using the dead of night as its conduit. George's ordeal wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And my story was the next chapter. As dusk fell, the familiar dread began to curdle into a grim, fatalistic resolve. I was waiting for it now. I had my laptop ready, my phone cameras active. I was no longer a victim hiding in a room. I was a system administrator for my own haunting, desperate to capture one final definitive log file. The power didn't flicker this time. It simply vanished at 2:45 a.m., plunging the house into that now familiar, suffocating silence. I didn't need to hear the footsteps to know they were coming. I could feel their approach, a vibration in the air, a pressure drop in the room. On my laptop, the camera feeds showed nothing. Empty halls, a still living room. But the audio from the cloud server was live. I heard it all, broadcast in pristine, high-definition horror. The slow, wet footsteps entering my hallway. They didn't pause at my door this time. The latch turned with a soft, definitive click. The door swung open. I stared at the empty doorway on my screen, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps entered my room. Thud, drag, thud, drag. They were on my rug now. The sound was muffled, but closer than ever before. I could hear the wet suction of each step, the soft, labored breathing that accompanied them. It was in my room, with me. I swung my head around, my eyes desperately scanning the darkness. But I saw nothing. The entity was a ghost in the machine, a phantom in the air, a presence only my ears and my technology could perceive. The footsteps crossed the room. They stopped directly beside my chair. The audio on my laptop peaked. A soft, wet, rhythmic sound followed the speakers. Shh. Heesh. It was right next to the microphone, right next to me. I felt a change in the air beside my left ear, a localized cold spot. The fine hairs on my neck stood on end. Then, a faint, moist exhale, so close it misted my skin. On the audio recording, my own sharp, terrified gasp was followed by the clearest, most chilling sound of all. Tap, tap, tap. The recording cut to static. I sat there, frozen, for a long time. The lights eventually buzzed back on. The refrigerator shuddered to life. The world pretended to be normal again. But the feeling of that exhale against my ear was a brand. A scar that would never fade. Mechanically, I checked the computer. A new file had been saved to my desktop, not the cloud server. A local file, as if it had been placed there by a hand reaching through the screen. It was titled, simply, George Recording, AM Wave. I couldn't bring myself to play it. I already knew what it contained. I knew the rhythm of its horror by heart. My investigation was over. I had my connection. I had my proof. There was nothing left to do but wait and wonder who would be next.
Hours later, as the sun rose, I finally moved from my chair. I walked away from the desk, from the laptop that still sat open. On its screen, the security camera application remained active, its window small in the center of the display. It showed a live color view of my empty bedroom, illuminated by the morning light. And on the ceiling, in the top corner of the frame, a long, pale, and unmistakable water stain had begun to spread, its shape slowly shifting in the silent glow of the monitor. Hit subscribe if you believe rationality isn't armor against the irrational. Hector built his life on binary truths and logical systems, and none of it protected him when the impossible came knocking. Don't let overconfidence in reason blind you. Subscribe if you think the most terrifying things exist precisely where logic ends. And if you've ever had your worldview shattered in a single night, comment, "My systems failed.